Gentlemen, I appreciate it. Just piggybacking off the Leo Strauss point, given the explicit and implicit myth making in the dialogues, what is the true Platonic metaphysics? Strauss and other interlocutors have demonstrated the dissonance between the exoteric and the esoteric Plato. So I'm sort of questioning what's the overall conclusion of these seemingly contradictory dialogues, or are they themselves a meta dialogue between competing ideals? Accordingly, is the realm of the forms itself a noble lie presented to ensure a moral foundation for society, even if untrue?
Thanks, Paul. That's a really hard question. I'll tackle it, I guess, first, and then Dr. Nog can chip in. So, yeah, Strauss distinguishes, among a few different kinds of esotericism. Like there's a kind of esotericism where the writer fears persecution and has a secret teaching that has some content that could be expressed, in words clearly, but it's a dangerous message either for himself or for the recipient. And so it's coded in a certain way so that only people who should be able to understand it, can have access to it, right? So there's that kind of esotericism. There's another kind of esotericism he talks about, which is a kind of pedagogical esotericism, where, even though you might be able to tell like a student something directly, plainly, right? You understand it to be the job of the teacher to not do that because it's important for the student in order to learn the right way or to really like wrestle with the idea in the right way such that it's properly learned, right? To not state it directly, but to use degrees of irony and misdirection and this sort of thing. I think there's almost certainly a good degree of the first kind of esotericism in Plato's works. But in terms of my own approach, I think it's useful to start with the assumption of pedagogical esotericism as being the primary way that Plato is educating us. And I think that that's the most useful starting point just because it resonates so well with the literary form that Plato uses. So the fact that he writes 35 dialogues, let's say, assuming they're all like authentic, maybe they aren't, I don't know. But 35 dialogues. He doesn't say, here's what I think about the world in the forms. Here it is. I hope you agree with me. I will lay out the arguments. But instead gives us this highly fragmentary view of things. And even in those dialogues, he's not the character. Socrates is. We know Socrates is identical to Plato because Socrates says you can't write philosophy in a written work of philosophy by a student Plato. For that and many other reasons, right? We know that they're not identical to one another. So what's going on there? Like, what do we make of the drama of the dialogue, the multiplicity of the dialogues, like all of these things? And it just seems to me that a very good starting point for that is to assume a kind of pedagogical esotericism, if you want to call it that. But basically, he's writing in such a way that the person reading really has to wrestle with the ideas, contradictory statements, right? And try to figure out what's true and what's false. So they're meant to kind of like nudge you to provoke you into philosophy, at least as much as they are meant to encode a secret philosophical teaching that once you decode, you will have the truth. That's my take anyway.
That's a great answer. I have nothing to add.
All right. Thank you, too. I think Kamak has another question.
Hello, gentlemen. Thanks very much for your time. And I want to say, if I had to pick a philosopher king for the United States of America, your names would be at the top of the list. But my question, I'll keep it quick. If Plato or Jefferson were to come to the United States in 2026 and write a sort of democracy in America of the current day, what would their primary topics of conversation be? And what would be their biggest issues or concerns with the American system?
I'll take a quick swing at that. I mean, if Jefferson were to come back today, I think he would be astounded and thrilled at the degree to which Americans of all different backgrounds, from all different continents of origin, had been allowed to make the most of their potential and proven themselves to be capable contributors to this great American experiment. I'm thinking specifically about African Americans. I mean, there's this famous passage in Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia. It's really cringy. He talks about what he thinks are some physical differences. One is that Black people sweat more, Jefferson claims. And, he's such a smart man. And it doesn't hit him that maybe Black people sweat more because they're out in the fields working, right? while he's reading books inside. But he also, reflects on what he thinks are the sort of mental capacities of people from different parts of the world. This doesn't take away from their humanity. It doesn't take away from their equal natural rights. But super cringy also, he says, Black people seem to be okay at telling stories, but haven't demonstrated great powers of analysis or great competence in mathematics. I think he says specifically. And of course, like, it's such a dumb comment too, because it was against the law in Virginia to even teach an enslaved person to read. So I think he would be so happy to see that his apprehensions and his fears about the capacities of African Americans were not well founded. I think he would be very concerned about the size of American government, really on all levels, the degree to which the national government does, far more things than the people who ratified the Constitution envisioned. The fact that we have a $40 trillion debt, I think would horrify him. I mean, one of the things that he endeavored to do as president, and with some success, is, despite the splurge of purchasing Louisiana for $15 million, he was able to pay off one third of the national debt that he had inherited from the Washington and Adams administrations. So I think those would be his big concerns.
Yeah, I'll just give you two maybe Platonic chapters in this democracy in America thing. One bleak and one maybe more uplifting. So the bleak one is, Socrates in the Republic describes a democracy in decay, slouching towards tyranny. And he says the most remarkable thing about it is that it can't make even basic distinctions between better and worse or higher and lower. He says parents start to dress like their kids, that all of these important distinctions, between like people who are living well and people who are living poorly. It even gets to the point, he says, where you can't distinguish between humans and animals. And, but his basic idea, I think, just to go off of what Dr. Bernal was saying a second ago about like five guys and the lawnmower, is like when you have all of these options equally available to you, because human beings are the kinds of creature who need some guidance, towards good things and away from bad things. When you can do absolutely anything, Plato was very pessimistic that most people will, arrive at a virtuous way of life. So in that sense, it's much more authoritarian than someone like Jefferson is, much more pessimistic, I guess, about the way that goes. And I think he would, find at least some evidence, I'm sure, if he were trying to, apply his regime analysis to our own regime. The more uplifting thing, Socrates has an account of social mobility where he thinks that, there's a kind of natural aristocracy that a just regime reflects it and gives opportunities for social privilege to be replaced by actual deserved, earned, natural, privilege, let's say. I think that is in some ways a loftier vision of social mobility than the one we typically use, which is basically, are you wealthier than your parents? Socrates would ask, are you more virtuous than your parents? And I think, he would probably find indications that still in our country, right, there are many avenues through which individuals can become more virtuous than their parents, more virtuous than the lot they were born into in life. And insofar as that's true, he would consider it a sign of our regime's justice and hopefully some optimism.
Cool. Last question from Caleb Anderson. Caleb, can you hear us? Okay, if not, if you can't figure out the audio, I guess like a basic question, kind of bringing it into the contemporary scene, is what regime, if any, would Plato consider the closest to his Republic, his city and speech today or in the past?
Go ahead, Rob.
That's one for you.
Well, can you repeat the question? Well, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I got it. What was the question?
So what regime, if any, today or in the past, would Plato consider the closest to his city and speech?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So I can start. Like I think that in general, it's hard to identify like a single regime that follows everything that Socrates prescribed. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think it was fully intended for that kind of an application. I think you would probably look at periods where in a monarchy where an extraordinarily virtuous king happens to rule. We can think of what virtuous king that would be, but I think also he would be open to recognizing certain kinds of, let's say, porous aristocracies that are open to people rising up into them. There are moments, certainly in 18th century England, I think, when you could say that that is more or less true of British aristocracy. Similarly, I think there are times in the American regime when you can say that the people ruling are genuinely admirable, virtuous types, and there's the capacity for people to rise up into that situation. I mean, it's one of the most remarkable things about our founding generation. For instance, to think of someone like a Hamilton. You guys know the opening of the musical, so I won't repeat it here. But coming from nothing, right? And similarly, from all sorts of different places, and achieving this remarkable thing that they did. So I would look at moderate aristocracies and then the occasional enlightened monarch as examples historically.
I'll use my last remaining bit of time to add my thanks. Dr. Liebert, did so at the beginning, but this has been a terrific conversation. And Will and Gary, I want to thank you guys in particular for putting so much effort into putting this together and starting this amazing organization. I mean, this is the sort of civic society that I think Jefferson, Tocqueville, who knows, maybe even Plato would have, really appreciated. And I saw your message, Will, that next month you were having as your guest General Petraeus. I mean, you are not aiming low. So I feel very honored to have been part of this first meeting. I'm sure Dr. Liebert does as well. So thank you for having us.
You're here. Thank you.
Thank you too. All right, Gary, do you want to close this out?
Yeah.
Wait, Will, Caleb just came up to say that
Oh, yes,
he
I
might
can see
he
him.
might be able to get it to work now. And if not, Caleb, you can put the question in the chat and we can respond to it. And there.
Hey,
Okay.
can you all see me
Yes, we
and
can.
hear me
Good to
now?
see you, Caleb. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. I'm sorry, guys. I'm in Iraq right now, so the network's a little bit shoddy, and so are the network permissions. So I had to switch to my phone. My question is actually two parts, but I've distilled it down to one just to respect y'all's time in case you need to get out of here. Kind of the lead-up question is off of, there was a comment that Dr. McDonald made about Jefferson really trusting elections as the means of putting the correct individuals into those positions of power. And one kind of strain of thought that I've recently been meditating on quite a bit is the idea that elections are perhaps not the means of putting the best people into power, but as assuring that when we have bad people in power, we can get rid of them, i.e. they are not somewhat like market mechanisms in the way that we search out the configuration space of ideology and political philosophy and put the best people into power, but we are just the safeguard of kicking people out to bring about the worst outcomes. And unfortunately, one of the reasons why I hopped on this call was because I don't know as much about Jefferson's thought or Plato's thought as I should. And I wonder if what we've been talking about tonight as the dialogue between democracy and aristocracy is a little bit tinged with this modern character, the character of our modern conversations that I think is a little bit tinged by the characterizations around markets and decentralized thinking producing good outcomes as opposed to looking for ensuring we don't have negative outcomes. And so I just want to elicit some thoughts from you, Dr. Liebert, or Dr. McDonald. Is it both in Plato and or in Jefferson that they believe that democracy would put in the best people in power? Or is it a mix of this, or is something different? Just looking for some clarification there.
I guess I'll take a swing at that, Hugh, unless you want to go first. So, Caleb, I think, that's a really great insight, that, maybe we don't always elect the best people. I mean, sometimes we do, I think, but not always. And of course, there are a bunch of elections that precede having two candidates on the ballot, which is usually the way it is. There are caucuses, there are primaries. But it's really important for the people to have an opportunity to veto the presence of a particular leader, to not reelect that person. So I think, that is maybe a really good function of democracy, maybe even better than selecting the very best person from among the 350 million of us, right, in the first place. I would say about the founding generation that it's just worth noting they really didn't use the word democracy. I mean, that's a much more modern word. When the Federalists were trying to pillory Thomas Jefferson and his political alliance, they described the Jeffersonian Republicans as Democrats, because they really distrusted their, I think, much more careful and strict and classical definition of democracy. They spoke in terms of republicanism and a much more sort of filtered mechanism of consent. And so, I just think it's worth taking note of that, because it's important not to impose our own presumptions or our own use of terms onto theirs.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Valent's point. I think it's a nice distinction you make between selecting the most virtuous and like vetoing the most vicious. Let's put it that way, right? And elections do both of those. And vetoing the most vicious might, in fact, be the more important, way that elections work. I thought your market point was really interesting too, and just in case it's helpful to anyone listening, I'll say that the market mechanism I don't think is the predominant metaphor in the ancient sources for thinking about elections, but they do tend to think in terms of competitions. So if you think about like even athletic competitions are really front and center, I think, in how they think about these things. That there's something about seeing people go toe to toe, like in a debate, for instance, in front of the assembly, that reminds them of people like competing in a chariot race or in wrestling or something like this. And there's a way that competition can bring out the best of people, and display very clearly, like in a way that's not obvious before people start competing, who the best of them is. More by the end of the baseball game about who's better than you did at the very beginning. And there are ancient authors, just to plug my man Plutarch, who make a lot out of that and arrange their whole way of presenting great individuals through competitions, precisely so you can understand who's better than the other person. So it's not only markets, right? They clarify, it's actually like athletic competitions and other forms of competitions too. I think it's an excellent question. And since I guess this is the end, thank you again, Gary and Will, for this really amazing opportunity. It's pretty humbling to be the opening act for General Petraeus. I hope we didn't flub that too badly. But thanks again.